Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Claudia, but maybe you know me better as EPALE moderator on EPALE. I'm part of the EPALE Central Support Service, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this EPALE webinar, which I guess will be a nice space for reflection, exchange, and we hope also some surprises for today. We live in a moment where it's kind of hard to escape the word AI. In fact, AI was also one of last year's EPALE thematic focuses. The word AI is everywhere. Actually, it's in policy documents, on our screens, in boxes, in newspapers, in classrooms. But it always comes with this familiar sense that everything is always changing and that we are right in the middle or at the threshold of something entirely new. But actually, are we? That's the question that we are going to ask today. That would be at the heart of this conversation with Joe Litobarski. We invited Joe, and thanks, Joe, for being here today. Joe is a PhD researcher at the University of Maastricht. He's specializing in the history of technology and democratic participation. Joe is giving this rare long-term perspective on this debate that too often forgets that it has a history, actually. So we are very grateful to Joe for joining us today, and we really look forward to this conversation ahead. So, Joe, thanks for being here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. So the first thing, hello everyone, welcome. Thank you very much, Claudia. Let me first share my presentation to begin with. And I'll put it into slideshow. So can everybody see the slideshow now? Yes, good. I'm getting the thumbs up from Claudia, so that's a good sign. Wonderful. Okay, so yes, exactly as Claudia said, it is incredibly hard to escape the word AI. It is pretty ubiquitous these days, and indeed there is this sense of a radical, something new, a radical break. A change that we have to adapt to as practitioners. Learners have to adapt to this change. AI is kind of everywhere. It's in the classroom. It's in the workplace. And exactly as Claudia sort of set up, what I'd like to do is just pause a moment, take a breath, and then introduce over the course of the next hour and a half a long-term perspective, a kind of long history of AI, of adult learning, and the relationship to democracy. And I want to do this because I mean, first of all, to highlight the fact that this word AI is not new. It's a word that has been with us since the 50s, and a lot of the concepts bound up in the word AI are older still. And it's changed. The meaning of the word AI has changed over time, and we can't see this change unless we take this long perspective. So I think it's helpful to sort of, rather than feeling this sort of panic of, oh my goodness, we're on the cusp of a revolution, to sort of think, okay, historically, we have been through similar transformations. We have been through kind of social transformations. We've seen kind of new technologies come in and reshape and kind of reconfigure society. So it's not necessarily the case that this radical new thing is happening. So yeah, first of all, thank you for EPALE for hosting the webinar. In a sense, what I'm interested in, so EPALE, obviously the acronym is Electronic Platform for Adult Learning in Europe. And actually this is more or less the focus of my research. I'm interested very much in the historical relationship between electronic platforms, we could think of them, adult learning and democracy. What is the relationship there? So in a sense, I'm going to be presenting over the next hour and a half a sort of long history of EPALE. And my hope is that thinking about the history of electronic platforms, adult learning and democracy is going to help us as practitioners to also think about the future of adult learning in the so-called sort of AI age. And so I'll start my talk with kind of these two photos on the kind of the first slide, which were taken around the same time. These photos were taken around 1945, 1946. On the left is an early mainframe computer. It's the first digital electronic programmable computer, sort of general purpose computer, which is called ENIAC, the Electronic Numerical Integrator and Computer. So it's a huge room-sized mainframe computer. And in the foreground, you've got Ruth Lichterman on the right and Marlin Westcroft, sorry, on the left. And these are two of ENIAC's first programmers, two of the first kind of computer programmers. And at the right, on the right at the same, this photograph taken at the same time is the American pragmatist philosopher John Dewey, who's typing away at a typewriter there, a mechanical typewriter. And whose work focused on education and democracy. And I think Dewey, as we kind of take this journey through this long, we're going to start in the 19th century. So Dewey was born in the 19th century, but his work kind of spanned both the 19th century and the 20th century. So Dewey is going to sort of accompany us as we go through the long history of AI, and he'll keep us thinking about education and democracy. So we will go into his thoughts. But first of all, who am I? So I'm Joe Litobarski. I'm a PhD candidate at Maastricht University. My research is in the history of public cybernetics, but you can think of that more broadly as the history of technology and democracy, indeed. And I'm particularly exploring the history of electronic democracy and experiments using electronic citizen feedback to facilitate various goals, one of them being civic education, adult learning, learning about democracy, how it works, participating in democratic practice to become kind of better, more democratic citizens, participatory decision making, and also collective intelligence. So these are kind of terms that are going to come up throughout the talk. My background is actually so I spent before I entered academia, I spent 10 years in policy circles in Brussels. So I set up a platform an electronic platform in 2011 with the think tank Friends of Europe, and this was called Debating Europe. And it was sort of conceived as a kind of electronic town hall or an electronic agora, which would bring citizens into dialogue with policymakers. So here's me kind of facilitating a couple of these are sort of webinars because there's an online component that you can't really see, but questions are being sent into these EU policymakers, European policymakers, and I'm kind of facilitating it, bringing the questions from the digital audience and also the in-person audience to the policymakers so that they can answer. And I ran this at Friends of Europe for 10 years. I was also involved in the Conference on the Future of Europe, if people know what this is, this large kind of continent-wide exercise in participatory and deliberative democracy. I was training facilitators for this. I've been involved in kind of citizens' assemblies and participatory and deliberative democracy for my kind of career in Brussels. And then I entered academia. I'm now kind of halfway through my PhD, retraining as a historian. And what I'm focusing on is the history of these sort of deliberative spaces that I was working on in the kind of 2010s. And when I was a practitioner, I thought it was a revolutionary period. We began Debating Europe when social media was the buzzword, not AI. Now it's AI. In around 2008, it was 2010, it was social media. And so we wanted to kind of really do something interesting with this new technology that was coming to absolutely transform politics. It was going to be revolutionary. It was going to overturn everything. I had no idea that there was such a long history of technologies coming in and people getting very excited and running essentially the same sort of deliberative projects, experiments that I was running with Debating Europe. So the last few years, I have been studying the long history of these deliberative and participatory projects facilitated by technology, and I'm going to present them a little bit to you today. And you will also hear a lot, I think, this term collective intelligence, which will come up. We're going to discuss this and put it maybe into, help perhaps to unpack a little bit what we mean by AI by contrasting it with collective intelligence. What is artificial intelligence? What is collective intelligence? I do think that artificial intelligence forces us to confront quite big philosophical questions like if we're thinking about what is artificial intelligence, it forces us, I think, to reckon with what is human intelligence. Right? What does it mean for humans to think if we're wondering, how can kind of machines think? If we're thinking about what is machine learning, it starts us thinking about what is human learning, what is, and also what is education, and what is the relationship to democracy. And as I said, luckily, we're going to have Dewey to help us think through some of these kind of big philosophical questions. So we'll introduce him. But first, just to say that collective intelligence is also kind of, as a concept, very bound up in these deliberative and participatory spaces. So on the right here, you've got a book called Democratic Reason by the scholar Hélène Landemire, and she's involved in some of the experiments in France to do with citizens' assemblies. She's running citizen assemblies in the US at the moment around the kind of midterm elections as well. And she's written this book really thinking about how do crowds, how do kind of groups of people come together, deliberate, and kind of make decisions, or kind of come up with kind of outputs that are collectively more than the sum of their parts. So that, what can we think of the kind of the deliberative space as a collective, which can, in a sense, be intelligent. And many of the electronic democracy experiments that I study in my research draw on some of these concepts, collective intelligence, and so on. And also, we'll introduce this idea that predates artificial intelligence called cybernetics. Some of you may have heard of this, which deals with questions of information, feedback loops, and so on, and again with the aim of promoting group decision making and collective intelligence. Here is a quick chapter, a summary of a chapter from Hélène Landemire's Democratic Reason, and you'll see she gives a kind of long history, a genealogy of the kind of the collective intelligence argument for democracy, including my friend Dewey, who's going to be with us. We'll get to Dewey. So these experiments that I'm looking at, they're not literally AI networks. These are experiments which are drawing on the same kind of systems thinking, what is called connectionist paradigm as early neural network models, as opposed to the rule-based symbolic AI paradigm. And I mentioned at the beginning, the word artificial intelligence, the meaning of this has changed over time. So we'll see how this it's changed from a kind of more symbolic, and we'll explain what that is, a more symbolic approach to a more connectionist approach today. I think that's really critical as well. It's not a new term, and in fact, there has been a shift over time. So we'll unpack that. If you want to think of, and so I suppose the big takeaway that I would like to kind of communicate over the next hour and a half is that we should not be thinking of artificial intelligence as an entity, as a kind of discrete, bounded thing. We often anthropomorphize it. We see, AI as a kind of like a, HAL 9000 from 2001, a kind of agent, which is autonomous, which is self-directed, which has kind of goals, and we focus on AI as this kind of thing with intelligence, cognition, and decision-making capacity, which encourages us, I think, framing artificial intelligence as an entity, that sort of forces us to think about AI in a certain way. I would kind of describe this as a kind of paradigmatic way of thinking about AI. And I want to contrast that to another way of thinking about AI, which I think is a much more productive way of thinking about AI, especially in the context of adult learning, democracy, education, and so on, which is to think of artificial intelligence as a system, not as an entity, but a system, a kind of more systemic approach. So this is seeing it as a kind of assemblage or a kind of cluster of models, of users, of kind of data, of kind of hardware, a stack of hardware, of kind of the platform, the applications. All of this together should be thought of as artificial intelligence, not just the kind of, we have this habit of kind of anthropomorphizing AI as, Claude or ChatGPT or something, not just this kind of imagined idea a kind of chatbot, but rather the entire kind of system that goes into the chatbot should be thought of, I think, as artificial intelligence distributed across infrastructures and institutions, absolutely dependent upon training data, upon the labor of individuals who are producing that data, of also maintenance and care, engineers, but both hardware, software engineers, but also kind of the maintenance and care for the individuals who are producing the data, and in governance in terms of institutions, in terms of kind of politics and political systems. So if we see AI as a system and as not as an entity, I think it helps us to really embed it in these big economic and political contexts, and it encourages us to start thinking in a different way about questions of accountability, power, and regulation. So that's my big kind of message for the next hour and a half, and I will unpack that. On the right is a book by Matteo Pasquinelli, who's an author who's trying to do this as well. It's a kind of a social history of artificial intelligence, trying to kind of unpack what AI means as a concept and move us away from this idea of AI as this discrete entity and towards seeing it more systemically and holistically. And when we talk about kind of paradigms and kind of ways of thinking, we'll have this constant tension between kind of hierarchy, top-down, kind of symbolic, representative, logic, rules-based ways of thinking, and also kind of more networked, kind of flat, distributed, connectionist ways of thinking. And there are also obviously hybrid models, which are kind of in between. And I think it's okay for that tension to exist. Dewey, as we kind of get into kind of Dewey's philosophy, will tell us that it doesn't make sense to think about these as, one is right and one is wrong. It's rather that, there is always going to be tension between these different ways of understanding, hierarchies versus networks. And it's about kind of, as a process, kind of developing, ways to manage, if we kind of apply it to society, the indirect consequences of social living. So let's get into Dewey to unpack what that means and how Dewey is going to help us to kind of navigate this long history and these quite complex kind of big ideas. So Dewey is a pragmatist philosopher. He was born in 1859 and died in 1952. So as I said, he spans, had a good long life and spans our period from the night. We're going to start in the 19th century and we're going to kind of go up to the 1990s where our history will end. And Dewey is going to kind of be with us all the way through. He's a leading figure in American pragmatism. And his argument is that knowledge emerges from inquiry and practical problem solving. So it is, education is absolutely lifelong for John Dewey. It is something that you're constantly doing, you're learning through doing. Democracy is a way of life. So in the 1920s, as America is confronted with the specters of totalitarianism in Soviet Russia, in the Soviet Union, but also in kind of fascist Italy, and soon in Germany as well. Dewey is kind of, arguing against a kind of technocratic way of thinking about, democracy as a failure. Democracy, we cannot compete with totalitarianism. We need to kind of to put these technocratic engineers in charge of solving problems because the public are just useless and they don't know what they don't know. And Dewey's arguing against this. He's taking a very strong stance in favor of democracy. And he's saying that it depends upon communication, participation, and shared inquiry. It's not just parliaments. It's not just the kind of top-down governments. It actually has to be kind of bottom-up. It has to be participatory. And indeed, like you cannot separate education from democracy. These two things have to go hand in hand. So he's very, very much in favor of education and experimentalism, trying different things and learning through doing. So he advocated schools as sort of laboratories for democratic practice and social intelligence. So remember Ellen Landermeer, who I mentioned at the beginning, this scholar who's working on citizens' assemblies, was also partly influenced by John Dewey. And ideas of kind of collective intelligence and social intelligence run through Dewey. But Dewey is really clear that that we should not, lose the individual in the collective. This is really important for Dewey. So in The Public and its Problems in 1927, he says individual human beings may lose their identity in a mob, or in a political convention, or in a joint stock corporation, or at the polls. But this does not mean that some mysterious collective agency is making decisions, but that some few persons who know what they are about are taking advantage of massed force to conduct the mob their way, boss a political machine, and manage the affairs of corporate business. So if we ever he's a very humanist thinker, and this is one of the reasons I'm very attracted to the work of Dewey. He sort of says if we ever start to see like a crowd or a corporation or a mob or something, or a party as a kind of mass, as a kind of anonymous entity, which has its own mind, then we're getting confused. We're losing sight of individuals, because it doesn't make sense to think of a collective without acknowledging that it's comprised of individuals. We're becoming confused if we lose sight of that relationship. Equally, though, he says, it doesn't make sense to say there's no such thing as a collective, as society. It's not the case that it's only individuals and there are no such things as crowds or joint stock corporation. That's also not the case. We have to keep both things in mind at the same time. And there has to be a kind of relationship and a dynamic between individual humans and kind of collectives. So this is, I think, a really important message, this sort of clarity, which is going to help us, I hope, to kind of untangle some of these questions about, what does it mean to be, to think systemically? What does it mean to think in terms of discrete entities? Dewey is hopefully going to say, well, you need both. You need to kind of keep in mind both at the same time. Right, but this is kind of the overview of what we'll be discussing, but let's start right at the beginning. What is history? As I'm a historian, so what am I interested in? I'm studying change over time and the events through which change occurs. And as an example, we can think of a big historic transformation. As an example of a big historic transformation, we can think of industrialization. So that will be the shift from kind of agrarian hand production economies to mechanized factory-based production in the kind of from the 18th to the 19th century, broadly speaking. And in terms of events, that might include the invention and spread of a steam engine. Now, obviously, the relationship between events and processes is quite complex, because it was not just one event and then done. The steam engine obviously was disseminated and applied to different specific uses as part of a process. So this historical process that we're looking at, industrialization, the one that we're considering as our first example, is made up of discrete events. Similarly, with another example, the process of digitalization, which we can think of as the shift from kind of analog to digital processes. Another event within this might be the invention and spread of the computer, or artificial intelligence, could be the internet, other inventions or innovations we can think of. But again, this is a process. It is not just a one-off event, not just a kind of one big bang radical transformation, but rather a process over time of multiple events. And importantly, I think contingent, meaning, it happened in a certain way, but it could have happened otherwise. It was not inevitable. It was not deterministic. I think this is something historians want to push back against. As a rule of thumb, historians usually stop about 20 or 30 years before the present. So around kind of 96 to 2006 will be the end of my period. I will go a little bit into at the very end. I'll kind of talk a little bit about contemporary events, but the bulk of this talk is going to be that kind of longue durée. And the reason is because we don't really know if something is a significant event or not until we have that window of time. It's quite hard for us to say, is this a lasting transformation? Are things genuinely changing unless you have that kind of long history? So the historical window just gives us that distance to be able to assess, has a transformation taken place or not, which is why we generally try to keep things outside of that window, although contemporary historians will want to keep on pushing that window closer and closer to the present. So events might still be happening, the change might not yet be complete. what is democracy? The second thing that I'm going to be if I'm looking at history and democracy in the age of AI, what is democracy? Well, this is more complex than it's easier for me to describe history as a discipline perhaps than democracy as a kind of what is it? Is it a process? Is it an event? It's not clear. Etymologically, the word comes to us from Greek, from kind of demos and kratos, the people or the populace, this kind of mysterious thing, the demos. It's not what is the demos, I think is an excellent question. And then rule or power. So in a sense, you can summarize it as power to the people. That is what democracy is. But what does that mean? If we think about some of the kind of entities that are associated with democracy, the two that come up often in my work and that will come up during this talk are the agora and the town hall. And so remember, when I was designing Debating Europe, I was thinking about it in these terms as like a social media town hall or a social media agora. This was my project. And I think it's important to kind of highlight that democracy classically was very different. The word democracy has meant different things over time, just as the word AI has, and the word democracy has kind of meant many different things historically. If we think about Athenian democracy, classical democracy, it was very, very restrictive in terms of who was eligible to participate in Athenian democracy, so in the polis. So free male citizens essentially could vote, could participate, could hold office, and in fact they were, according to Aristotle, they were defined as citizens by their capacity to hold office. It was the fact that they were eligible to hold office that made them citizens, and this excluded women. Excluded slaves and migrants or metics. Aristotle was a metic, by the way. So they were not citizens of the polis and they could not participate. And in some estimates suggest it's about only 10 or 20% of the population of a city or a polis could actually participate in early kind of classical democracy. A later example, which is the town hall, is often also held up as a kind of ideal type of democracy. So this is a kind of 17th century American phenomenon, really. New England in particular, kind of on the east coast of America. These were small face-to-face systems of local self-government in the early kind of colonial period of the not the United States, but North America. This is kind of the early days of colonization, in which male church members, and these were usually Puritans, who had left England in particular, and they were property holders, they were so-called freemen, they voted directly on community affairs within this religious framework of Puritanism often, and with women, indigenous people, and servants and slaves excluded. So similarities between the kind of the classical model and the kind of New England town hall. But something changes. Right, so historians are interested in what's changing, what's staying the same. Something begins to change in the 19th century as we start to move from a kind of more classical conception of democracy, maybe a more elite democracy, to popular democracy or kind of mass democracy. So, I mean, I think when people think of the emergence of kind of contemporary or modern democracy, we often think about these 18th century revolutions, like the American Revolution, like the French Revolution. I think it's important to remember that actually these 18th century revolutions are more about kind of constitutional checks on the state, constitutional checks on authority and power. It's important to remember that in the American Revolution, for example, in terms of voting for the president, we're still talking about a slave-owning elite who were able to vote, so the franchise is very, very restricted. But we start to see agitation over time for an expansion of the franchise. So we begin to move from a kind of elite conception of democracy to a kind of more mass idea of democracy as mass society begins to emerge in the 19th century with the processes, these long historical processes of industrialization and urbanization, which support mass society. So, you start to see people move from the countryside into the cities, because suddenly you can have industrialization can support a kind of bigger, larger urban population through kind of greater productivity in terms of agricultural output. So you can feed people, you're able to, and this gives rise, as you start kind of cramming people together into cities, this gives rise to new forms of social organization, civil society. So you start to get the emergence of trade unions coming out of the guild tradition. You get new church organizations, new kind of ways of configuring life, and political demands as well, including in the field of, people are demanding things like better living conditions, better wages, better workplace conditions, but also kind of access to education. So we're starting to get kind of agitation and political kind of transformations. And I think, why do I stress this? Because I think there has been this is a transformation over time. I do think this is a change over time. And I do think it's important. And now that we're kind of all thinking about, as well as AI, I think another term which is on everyone's mind is authoritarianism right now. And I think it's important to just take a moment and emphasize that this kind of pluralist liberal democracy with kind of mass political parties and universal suffrage, so everyone has one person, one vote, everyone kind of has the opportunity to vote, that's a very recent phenomenon. That's very, very recent. Largely a 20th century phenomenon, and even post-war, so second half of the 20th century. And in many places, actually only after the 1970s. Or even, so if you think of places like Spain and Portugal and Greece, for example, we're talking after the 1970s, but then in Eastern Europe, in large parts of kind of the former Soviet Union and Warsaw Pact countries, it's even after like 1989, after the 1990s. So within, you can think of kind of these waves of democratization, and the kind of, when we think of the word democracy, there has been a change over time. It has not meant the same thing. It's not completely stable. And often when we think of democracy today, what we actually mean is something that's very, very recent, within a generation. All right. I would say that just to say it's also potentially very fragile, this experiment that we're running with pluralist liberal democracy, and I would say quite precious and something to be protected. Okay, what do we mean by I'd like to show you an image, because I want to really emphasize this change that has taken place, this kind of development of mass society. So this is a painting by George Bellows from 1913. It's in a kind of tenement area of New York City, which is one of the largest cities one of the largest urban populations in the world at this time. I think London is the largest city in the world in 1913, but New York will overtake it as the largest city by, I believe, the 1950s, I think. And what you are struck with when you look at this painting is people. There's people everywhere the eye goes, right? The cliff dwellers are on these balconies, these kind of fire escapes, and they're all kind of up the sides of the tenement buildings. They're kind of crowded in front of you. There's a mass of people everywhere. And if we look inside the buildings, if we take a look at the next image, this is a photograph from a social activist, Jacob Riis, again in New York City, lodges in a crowded Bayard Street tenement. It's a little earlier, it's 1889, but you can see even inside these buildings here are people. Right, the people are just crammed into these tenements. So when I talk about this agitation for better living conditions, but one of the people like Jacob Riis, the photographer who took this image, partly to kind of raise awareness of the conditions in these tenement buildings. One of the things that is being agitated for is better living conditions, better kind of there are kind of slums and poor kind of living conditions. How to kind of like improve kind of the quality of social living, the consequences and as Dewey would put it, the kind of indirect consequences of social living, how to kind of better manage those. This graph just shows you the scale of this transformation, I think. So this is from the US Census Bureau, and it shows you in the US, this urban and rural population transformation over time. So my historical period properly begins in the 1950s. Although I look back into the 19th century, and by then 60% of people in America are living in urban centers. But this is a huge transformation over 100 years. from, you know, what we'll say about like 20%, less than 20% to 60% is you know, big numbers of people are going into these cities, and it's happening at a kind of a large scale. So yeah, so industrialization and urbanization are giving form to new forms of collective life, and you get the rise of the mass as both a social reality, crowds, public and civil society, but it also is presenting a problem for elites. And this is kind of exemplified in a book by the French author Gustave Le Bon, who wrote a very influential book called The Crowd in 1895. And he suggests that masses are irrational, emotional and suggestible, and that individuals in crowds, they lose their reason and they regress to primal instincts. They become there's a sort of madness of the crowd. Like, you know, he's thinking about riots and the way that people kind of become anonymous and just, you know, they can just do whatever they want with that anonymity, and they can behave completely kind of irrationally. Sigmund Freud is also kind of writing same sort of a little bit later, but similar sort of time, about mass psychology, the kind of psychology of the crowd. And I think, how do we understand this? You know, there is a sort of mysterious element to this, because Le Bon is sort of presenting the crowd almost like an entity, like it can kind of have its own will. And I think important to sort of step back. Dewey is going to help us here. Remember, if we start to lose individuals into the crowd, we're becoming confused. We're making a kind of an error, I think. And so I think we can understand Gustave Le Bon, Sigmund Freud's mass psychology, this kind of anxiety of the crowd as an elite fear about the political power of mobilized masses. Because it's true that as they agitate, the crowd is also very powerful politically. But there is a kind of fear here, and the fear is also related to technology, specifically kind of media technology, which is that newspapers in the 19th century, the so-called kind of yellow papers, but later on radio and film, and then eventually television, are tools that can be used to manipulate and homogenize populations, to kind of to put people into this kind of irrational, emotional crowd behavior, and then kind of steer them and manipulate them, just as Dewey says that this is a risk. So massification is, you know, there's a kind of fear of people leaving the kind of traditional societies of the countryside and moving into cities where everything is new, everything, you know, the old rules and the old norms don't apply anymore. Suddenly people are uprooted and they can do whatever they want. They'll become irrational and emotional and violent, and you know, it'll be very uncivilized and awful. This is the kind of elite fear and anxiety, and it will also lead people to become vulnerable to propaganda and ultimately to totalitarian control. And this is a still from Triumph of the Will, from the Nazi propagandist Leni Riefenstahl's. You know, she's a film director. This film came out in 1935, and it was kind of a very advanced, kind of cutting edge film. You know, it introduced lots of techniques. The cinematography was very kind of like impressive at the time, and it presented the fascist regime of Nazi Germany as a very kind of technologically forward looking society. You know, the Adolf Hitler, I think there is a scene in the movie, or it's in one of Riefenstahl's movies, I think it's Triumph of the Will, where Hitler arrives on an airplane, you know, very modern technology. He comes you know, into the film kind of riding on an airplane, and then kind of disembarks and kind of speaks to the crowd. And you can see the kind of mass of people are ordered in, you know, they're arranged in very kind of ordered kind of lines, and this is the kind of the fear of kind of elites, that, you know, people will be manipulated. Here's a close-up of an individual in the crowd, same movie, Triumph of the Will, and you can see this sort of expression of rapture on this man's face. It's a sort of almost a religious expression. He looks like he has been hypnotized. He looks like he's been sort of mesmerized by he's looking at Adolf Hitler here, by the kind of the leader of the state. And the historian Fred Turner has kind of pointed out that this anxiety was really very, I mean, it's hard to kind of to put ourselves in the position of someone in the 1930s, who's, you know, now historians will say, the the fascism was a historically contingent set of movements which arose out of structural conditions like the Great Depression, mass unemployment. These sort of things gave rise to fascism. But at the time, fascism as a social phenomenon was blamed on the radio. Right, was blamed on the hypnotizing and mesmerizing power of the radio. So in the late, and this is the historian Fred Turner, who says in the late 1930s, if anyone doubted the power of the mass media to remake society, they only needed to turn to Germany. How could the mustachioed madman Adolf Hitler have taken control of one of the most culturally sophisticated nations in Europe, many wondered, if he hadn't hypnotized his audience through the microphone and the silver screen? And this notion of hypnosis really does come from Sigmund Freud, mass psychology, and Gustav Le Bon, this idea that kind of it's possible to kind of, mesmerize people through force of will. There are maybe some parallels to the kind of discourse around disinformation today, right? Is authoritarianism related to kind of social media disinformation? Which brings me right after this kind of introduction, what is democracy? What is history? How does kind of industrialization cause create the conditions for mass society? And then, out of that we get mass media, which supports new forms of social organization. In the 30s, one of the things that democracies were very concerned about the sweep of totalitarianism. Dewey is writing at this time, so this is now when Dewey is writing, like in the a little earlier in the 20s, but he's still kind of active in the 30s. So democracy is on the back foot. Democracy is feeling under peril. It feels like democracy is too slow. It's not able to kind of solve problems. These authoritarian dictators are able to kind of come in, and they can very quickly make decisions. And there is this genuine fear that because they're so charismatic, people like Mussolini, like Hitler, like Stalin, they're able to mesmerize listeners on through the radio to kind of control them, to kind of manipulate them, and to hypnotize them, mesmerize them. So what does democracy do? How does democracy kind of fight back against this? And this is America's Town Meeting of the Air, which is from 1935, which is the first radio town hall project. So in a sense, this is kind of where the technological town halls, these electronic town halls that I'm interested in, they sort of start here. And it's important that this is understood as a adult learning exercise, right? Not necessarily couched in those terms. It's thought of as a civic education exercise. But the idea is that we will bring Americans together through the power of the radio. They will deliberate, and they will discuss, and they will practice democracy. And in the act of deliberating and discussing and practicing democracy, they will learn about democracy, and they will learn the value of democracy. Right? So this is the idea. So it began as a 6-week experiment on the NBC Blue Network, which is a radio network, and it was moderated by George Denny, who's the executive director of the League for Political Education. So this is the kind of the civic education mission of the League. Actually begins with the suffragette movement. In fact, there is an argument against expanding the suffrage that women are irrational. Women are not capable of rational thought like men, and so they can't be trusted with making democratic decisions. They can't be trusted with the vote. And so the League for Political Education was partly founded as a way to kind of push back against this argument restricting this franchise by saying, well, then if you believe that women are irrational and that women are uneducated, let us educate them so that your argument is no longer valid, right? Your argument that women don't have the kind of education of men, it's solvable. It's a solvable problem. Now, I think the argument was not made in good faith. Maybe you can say this, but the kind of the justification for the League, this was kind of how it was kind of put forward. This idea that that participation, is a form of education, right? So if women participate in these kind of town hall discussions and so on, they will become responsible citizens who can then be given the franchise. That was the thinking. So it was conceived of as a radio adaptation of New England town hall meetings, aimed to kind of strengthen democracy through public discussion. At the same time, we get you start to get kind of so social scientists become very interested in all of this the mass democracy, the kind of the new forms of kind of participation offered by all these people kind of living in urban centers, and the way that that the radio can kind of can influence public opinion. And so, scientists start trying to collect data to kind of quantify how is it that this kind of effect, this effect of mesmerization, how is this happening? And you get a couple of social scientists in the 1930s participating in something called the Princeton Radio Research Project. So this is kind of 1937, around the same time as America's Town Meeting of the Air. And in fact, one of the things that the Radio Research Project did was interview audiences and research audiences of America's Town Meeting of the Air. So the two are, they're very interested in specifically America's Town Meeting of the Air, as well as kind of other projects. And the aim was to study the effect of radio on mass audiences. So some of the key figures were Paul Lazarsfeld, who's a sociologist, and Frank Stanton, who's a broadcasting executive. And they wanted to develop kind of empirical quantitative methods. This meant kind of surveys and experiments, but also something called the program analyzer. So they invented the like button. This is the first like button, genuinely called the like button. So this was a button which audiences had as I'll go back to the last slide. They had this button in front of them. They actually had two buttons. They had a like button and a dislike button, so they could press either. And they could watch a film. This was a propaganda film generally, or they could listen to an episode of America's Town Meeting of the Air. And when they liked content in the show, they would press the like button. And if they were bored, if they were disengaged, they would press the dislike button. So you can see this could then be mapped onto a graph showing when were they liking, when were audiences engaged, and when were audiences disengaged. So you have if we think about social media data and kind of likes and engagement and so on, you can trace, I think, the like button all the way back to very, very early experiments in kind of quantitative social research, which are in the kind of 1930s here. They also, one of their findings was actually to push back against this idea of mesmerization. So a famous finding is the so-called two-step flow of communication. So they argued that mass media is not actually a direct, hypnosis beam from the leader to the audience, but rather there are these kind of intermediary opinion leaders. We might call them influencers today, who then they have their own audience, and they're able to kind of disseminate from the mass media to their audience, or their kind of group of followers. Again, 1937, we recognize some of this language. Followers, they didn't use influencers, but we could recognize the concept, I think. Simultaneously, what's also happening, so this is a complex story, lots of things are happening, and I think the history of the computer is also important, because the history of the computer is going to intersect with the history of media, right? We're going to have by the 90s, we know that now, when we're talking about like buttons, when we're talking about influencers and so on, we mean on our phones, we mean on our computers. So in the 1930s, computers are still human at this point. This is you could be a computer as an individual. So you could have a profession or a profession, but you could have a job as a computer, which would be to compute manually by not using digital electronic technology. For example, mathematical tables. So the 1938 Mathematical Tables Project brought in a lot of volunteers, and they would basically sit at desks and do kind of sums in order to tabulate ballistics tables for the war effort. So this was the kind of idea. So that it was if you're firing an artillery shell and you need to calculate, what trajectory does it need to be used? You can do the maths. There's some maths involved in order to do this, and you can do this much faster if a human computer has kind of done this for you. So they put together a large book. It was not ready in time, I believe, to use during the war. But that was the kind of idea behind the Human Computing Project. And before electronic machines, it's mostly forgotten. but actually thousands of clerks, often women, this labor was very gendered, carried out large-scale calculation and data processing for science, engineering, military, and these human computers, they worked in structured teams, including kind of wartime and Cold War projects. They were working at NASA. There's a wonderful film called Hidden Figures, which tells the story of some human computers. If you'd like, and it's based on a book. I recommend kind of seeing that film. It's an excellent film, and it kind of gets into this history of computers before they were digital. But there is a shift from the human computers to digital computers, to electronic computers. And I think it's important, again, to think about, how the word computer has changed over time, just as the word AI has changed over time, just as the word democracy has changed over time. It's not stable. It's not always the same thing that we're thinking about. And one of the things that historians try to avoid is presentism. We really try to kind of develop historical empathy with the past and to try to understand, if we're historians of technology, artifacts as much as possible from the perspective of people who are encountering them for the first time. And it's really hard to think about computers. What is a computer doing? So we anthropomorphize. Right, we kind of project we use metaphors which help us to think about what a computer is doing. And a very, very common metaphor in the press was the computer as an electronic brain. Right, these analogies between kind of machines, brains, and even societies, they're not new. So ENIAC, which I introduced at the beginning of this talk, was introduced as an electronic brain to the press, and it was described as kind of thousands of times faster than Einstein at calculating kind of sums. So it's important, I think, to keep that in mind. And in fact, yes, so there is, I think, we can also get kind of a little bit fixated on this idea that, a computer must be radically different because it uses electricity. It's an electrical, or somehow there's some magic that happens with digital technology. Something happens, and that it means that it's very, very distinct from human intelligence, or from kind of the ways that non-electronic or non-digital kind of systems work. And this, Alan Turing, writing in the 50s, is a famous kind of figure in the history of computing, kind of points out this is a superstition. Theoretically, there is no reason why computing has to be done electrically or electronically. And historically, we know it wasn't. It was done by humans. So human labor kind of was then automated and digitized and electrified, or made to take place on an electronic machine, but it was done by hand previously. So he says, Babbage, who's a 19th century kind of pioneer of the computer, Babbage put together this purely mechanical analytical engine using no electricity, no kind of electronics, definitely. And he says the fact that it was mechanical helps us to rid ourselves of a superstition. It worked. You could run, you could do kind of computing on an analytical engine, but it wasn't electronic. And it's so this importance that we attach to the fact that modern digital computers are electrical is a superstition. And maybe there's something in the fact that the nervous system is electrical. No, Turing says that's not the case. Babbage's machine was not electrical, and since all digital computers are in a sense equivalent, theoretically, we see that this use of electricity cannot be of theoretical importance. Of course, electricity usually comes in where fast signaling is concerned, so it's not that surprising that we find both of these connections. So what is interesting is the fact that that electricity allows us to send signals quickly, but it's not electricity in itself that is important. It's the fact that signals can be sent quickly. And on the right, this is a still from The Three-Body Problem, which is a TV show on Netflix, where kind of a sort of human computer is portrayed in the show based on the kind of novel by a Chinese science fiction author. Here's a kind of big overhead shot of the human computer. Theoretically, there's no reason you couldn't run a computer using humans. And in fact, as the Human Computing Project shows, the Mathematical Tables Project, historically they were run using humans. So we need to kind of unpack a little bit what is a computer and what is happening with electricity. This brings us to cybernetics, which I think is so before AI was this concept cybernetics. What is cybernetics? Cybernetics can be kind of understood, I think, in terms of three core concepts: information, feedback, and black boxes. And we'll just kind of quickly go through these things. First, what is information? So cybernetics is a science of communication and control that is really interested in questions of collective intelligence, questions of kind of how decisions are made, communication and control in individuals, but also in kind of like collectives and between kind of machines and organisms. And the concept of information is absolutely core to cybernetics. So to kind of try to explain the concept, imagine you have a puzzle box. And most of the kind of arrangements in the puzzle box are very, very disorganized. We can call them kind of entropic. They're sort of, some puzzle pieces might be one way up, some puzzle pieces might be another way up. They're all over the place. So you've shaken this puzzle box. There is only one correct arrangement. There's only one that forms a correctly organized picture of a cat, the lovely cat on the front box of the box. And for Norbert Wiener, who's one of these scientists who's thinking about cybernetics. He's one of the founding fathers of cybernetics. Information is a quantified measure of the reduction of entropy. What that means is as the puzzle is assembled, entropy or disorganization decreases and information or organization, or as he terms it, kind of negative entropy or neg entropy increases. So you get a kind of, you're able to quantify how many puzzle pieces are we away from a completed picture of a cat. And you can measure then how organized or disorganized the system is. That is the kind of the basic idea. The second and the third concepts, as well as information, are feedback and black boxes. So feedback essentially is kind of is about flows of information, output and input. And a black box basically says, it doesn't really matter what happens in the black box. In fact, we cannot see what's happening in the black box. What is happening is the processing of information. The black box is interesting because it outputs information and then it inputs information. Information is inputted in a feedback loop, a continuous kind of feedback loop. And actually, this is not a new concept. This is a concept coming out of thermodynamics. So when we talk about entropy, that we're also, entropy is very important in thermodynamic theory in the 19th century, and it's coming out of control engineering as well. So, instead of information, you can think of steam, like a steam engine, and you can kind of think of a process of manual control. Like imagine you have like a kind of a steam engine, and kind of steam is basically flowing through some kind of industrial process, and you have a valve which shows how kind of hot the system is. Maybe the steam is kind of heating up the pipes, and there's a human operator who has to shut off the process if the machine gets too hot. Because otherwise you could have a kind of catastrophic failure. The steam could overheat and explode the boiler or something like this. So this is kind of manual control. An automatic control would be if there's no human in the loop. There's no human in this process. So once there's a sensing element, but once the temperature gets above a certain point, there's an automatic cutoff. And then the temperature lowers. And then once it lowers to below a certain threshold, the process kicks in again. So it's completely self-regulating. And in fact, in the 1960s, many people thought of automation in terms of cybernation. This is the word which sounds very old-fashioned to us, but was kind of quite popular at the time. And this is from a book, Man and Automation from 1957, a popular kind of book explaining automation. And it says, many people now hold that industrial working can only be said to use automation if feedback is incorporated in the plant and equipment, and that if it is not incorporated, the term mechanization is a sufficient description, which is to say that, feedback is the thing that distinguishes between manual control and automatic control. Feedback is kind of automation. So, you cannot disentangle cybernetics from automation, from kind of, taking humans out of the loop. So all of this is to say that cybernetics essentially kind of generalizes feedback control. It says, okay, we have steam processes, we have kind of the Industrial Revolution gives us the steam engine, but the modern factory will be based on information. It will not be based on steam. It will be based on kind of flows of information which are controlling different things. And this generalization applied not just to factories, but also to societies as a whole. So Norbert Wiener, who's the father of cybernetics. He coins the term cybernetics. He writes this book called Cybernetics in 1948, and in it he says it's certainly true that the social system is an organization like the individual that is bound together by a system of communication and that has dynamics in which circular processes of a feedback nature play an important part. So we can conceptualize the political system, society, as a kind of cybernetic system with feedback from kind of decisions and policies going back into the demands and the kind of support from the crowd. And this is David Easton, who's a political scientist who kind of who's put this diagram together. So information then is no longer just a kind of metaphor, but it's actually a kind of claim about reality, or a kind of ontological claim. So Wiener famously says, information is information. It's not matter or energy. It's not steam. It's not energy. No materialism that does not admit this can survive at the present time. And we start, I think I'm hesitant about this, because I think once you start to say information is not a metaphor, it's a real thing in the world, you begin to kind of, I think, fall into the trap of saying, well, maybe, the human brain is not metaphorically a computer, perhaps it's literally a computer. Maybe, the individuals are kind of interchangeable. You can kind of take out, they're just sort of components in a great big machine. You can take out one person and kind of plug in another person. I think that's quite dangerous thinking. I think Dewey would agree. We should be very careful, cautious about not losing the individual in the crowd. And cybernetics, I'll start to kind of, we've got about half an hour, so I'll kind of take us from the I'll go into the 60s, and then we'll kind of bring it up into the present day. But cybernetics, in terms of artificial intelligence, is deeply entangled with the long history of AI. And in fact, I would say that when we use the term AI today, we would probably be better off using the term cybernetics, because I think, and I'll explain, why I'm making this claim over the next kind of half hour, basically. So this is John McCarthy, who coined the term artificial intelligence. In a book review in 1988, he says one of the reasons for inventing the term artificial intelligence was to escape association with cybernetics. Its association with analog feedback seemed misguided, and I wished to avoid having either to accept Norbert Wiener as a guru or having to argue with him. And I think there is something kind of mysterious and a bit mystical about cybernetics. And I can understand John McCarthy's reservations, because, if anyone has any familiarity with kind of systems thinking or kind of holistic ways of seeing things, that there's a kind of deep tradition in the counterculture, in perhaps more kind of like traditions that are borrowing from like Eastern mysticism and kind of Buddhism and like holistic thinking and so on. So there are these associations, and I think it can be very tempting to say, oh, well, we'll create AI as something to escape from all of those mystical entanglements. I think that's fair, but then I think we get a bit confused once AI shifts back to a kind of more cybernetic way of thinking, as it has done. So neural networks are deeply, deeply entangled with cybernetics. And I think this is something that people just are not aware of, because the history is a little bit hidden and quite complicated. AI was founded, in a sense, to escape from neural networks. And yet ChatGPT is fundamentally based upon neural networks as an architecture. So AI was really like, if somebody found, for example, if John McCarthy had seen ChatGPT, he would be horrified. He would say, this can't possibly work. And yet it works. This is Frank Rosenblatt on the left, who's working with the first hardware instantiation of a neural network, which is in 1958, I think. But the first theorized neural network was McCulloch and Pitts in 1943. So, neural networks predate AI. And neural networks are the dominant paradigm in AI today. This is, when we think of AI, what we mean really are large language models or neural networks. So we have had this shift in cognitive paradigms from a kind of more symbolic approach to a kind of more networked connectionist approach. And I'll unpack what that shift means. But just to kind of take a brief point and say that AI paradigms make claims about human intelligence. right? So this all happens consistently. So in 1961, this is a documentary about thinking machines, and a scientist comes and says, we're trying to illustrate with this program that we've produced, this AI program, we're trying to illustrate some important things about artificial intelligence. What we're trying to show is that intelligent behavior is rule-obeying behavior, right? We can think of it as kind of more hierarchical, symbolic, rule-obeying behavior. Today, this is Geoffrey Hinton in 2025, who's he's so-called godfather of deep learning. And he says, up until now, most people, including in the humanities, this would be me, have thought we sort of reason using something like logic, like rules-based, hierarchical logic, symbolic representational logic. We're rational beings. This is the thought. We're not. We're great big analogy machines. We're not rational beings. We're irrational. We're much closer to kind of Gustave Le Bon's idea of the crowd, where we just make kind of, we're impulsive, we make kind of connections, which is a paradigm much closer to the kind of network distributed paradigm. It's a connectionist way of seeing thought, cognition, but it's also a claim about how humans work. I've built this deep learning model, and therefore I know how humans work as well, how human intelligence works, which is, Geoffrey Hinton has won the Nobel Prize in physics, so he must be an authority who knows how the human mind works. But this scientist is making a claim in the 60s, which is directly contradictory to the claim making in the 2020s. So I'm not arguing, Geoffrey Hinton's wrong and this particular scientist is right, or vice versa. I'm just pointing out that these claims are being consistently made historically based upon the experiments that are being done in artificial intelligence. So the AI term, if we think of historical events, it's coined in Dartmouth, the Dartmouth workshop in 1956, which is seen as a kind of birthplace of AI, like a radical break. And in a sense, it's trying to kind of self-mythologize as a radical break from cybernetics. Some of the individuals involved are really kind of working, within a cybernetic paradigm, such as Claude Shannon, who's on the right of this picture here. But they kind of are frustrated with the kind of, the guru of Norbert Wiener and the kind of mysticism of systems thinking, of a kind of more holistic approach. So they would like to focus on symbolic AI, which is their big innovation. And symbolic AI is rational, is logical, and is rule-based. It's rule-governed symbol manipulation, structured with explicit representations. Knowledge is encoded in well-defined symbolic structures, hierarchies, lists, trees, and so on. And it emerges from a sort of Cold War logic as well. AI research is embedded in Cold War strategic rationality. Like the Cold War is like a game played between players on a chessboard with nuclear weapons. We're trying to kind of, nuclear strategy is a rule-based game between superpowers. This is like an example of a piece of game theory, The Strategy of Conflict by Thomas Schelling, who kind of argues that intelligence is rule discovery, a study of conscious intelligence. Sophisticated conflict behavior, of successful behavior, is like a search for rules of correct behavior in a contest-winning sense. So Herbert Simon, who's an early kind of, he's one of the people involved in symbolic AI, a very important figure. He's sort of seeing intelligence as a procedural kind of hierarchy. Here he is playing kind of chess. And here you can see, so for example, a decision tree for the opening moves of E4 and D4. So you can map out all of the possible configurations. And, they spent a long time trying to map the game of chess. Claude Shannon, for example, did this, I believe, to kind of map out every possible configuration of the chessboard, and to kind of determine which is the most intelligent, path through this decision tree. And the historian of technology, Nathan Ensmenger, says this is a deeply political move, right? Despite the seeming intangibility, algorithms are anything but ephemeral or immaterial. Like all technical innovations, they are fundamentally human and social constructions, and as such embody and enable specific values, agendas, and possibilities. So I just want us to be sensitive to the possibility that this is happening again. It has happened in the past, where intelligence is defined by the people who are making these intelligent systems as doing what these intelligent systems do, right? So if you are intelligent, you will be able to play chess successfully. I've built a machine that plays chess successfully, therefore it's an intelligent machine. This is the kind of the logical kind of argument. Oh, have I just stopped sharing? Hang on a second. I'm conscious of the fact that I've only got 15 minutes, so I'm going to rush through the end of this to kind of tie it up. There we go. So again, we're kind of seeing this kind of shift in cognitive paradigms and ways of thinking about thinking. I'll rush through some of this. Just what is happening in the 60s is we're seeing television. So we're leaving the kind of radio age, and television, consumer electronics are flooding the market, and more consumers have access to television. So we're entering the kind of mass media age of television. So now a majority of US households own a television, and they're seeing images of the Vietnam War. They're seeing the civil rights movement, police brutality, televised protests, and so on. And you have a counterculture which is which is kind of wants to see a future which is, they don't want to just be sent to Vietnam. They don't want to, they would like to kind of have social justice. That there's a counterculture which is agitating for these things. So there's a kind of generational kind of divisions here. There's kind of, we would maybe describe them as kind of culture war divisions. There's also political violence in the United States. You've got the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., Bobby Kennedy. You have kind of race riots. So it's a very febrile, tense time. There's huge tension with the Soviet Union, with around kind of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and around Soviet tanks going into Hungary and Czechoslovakia, and then Hungary in the 50s, and then Czechoslovakia in the 60s. So there's many things that we recognize about the 60s as a moment, and politics democracy is becoming televised now. We're moving from radio in the 30s to kind of television in the 60s, with the first US presidential debate in 1960, Kennedy-Nixon, where 70 million people tune in to watch this. It is a huge landmark moment in politics. And there's a distinction, allegedly, this is a little bit mythologized, or it's unclear, at least it's controversial between social scientists, whether there's a distinction between radio listeners and TV audiences, whether radio listeners think that Nixon wins because he's got more detail and substance, whereas TV viewers think that Kennedy is more handsome, and so he's the winner of the debate. So again, this anxiety about people being manipulated by the kind of the medium. I think I have time to run through kind of one of my projects, which is kind of again, it's a civic education project. So it's not about making participatory decisions, or it's not really about collective intelligence. It's organized by the Center for Civic Education with a grant from the Ford Foundation, and it's built on kind of radio town halls, which date back to the 30s and America's Town Meeting of the Air. And the idea, again, is that we'll bring people together using this new technology of television, and they will participate in deliberation. And through doing this, they will learn how to be better citizens. They'll learn the practices of democracy by taking part in them. These are some. I went to the archives in St. Louis, and these are some of the photos that I've taken. One of the things that I love about the Metroplex Assembly project is that they distributed handbooks. So people were both in audiences in kind of venues, churches, and community centers, and so on. But they also watched Metroplex Assembly at home. There was a 2-episode format, so that you could have feedback between the initial episode, and then people would they'd set up a problem facing St. Louis as a community, they were talking about migration coming from outside of St. Louis, or they would talk about kind of street art, or whatever issue they would want to talk about, overcrowding, whatever it was, and then they would have people watch at home on television, as well as in audiences in these kind of civic centers. Then they would people would write in or call in their questions and their comments, and you would have a kind of second episode broadcast which would respond to the feedback. So there was a kind of call and response design format for the program. And viewing handbooks for viewing posts around the city were distributed. This is a photo of a viewing post. You can see that the participants are very seriously watching with their notebook and so on. And they had little handbooks explaining, what is the best seating arrangement, what are the best refreshments to serve, thinking not just about the show, but also kind of the environment within which people are watching this television town hall. Like final point, and then I will, I'll close for kind of questions. Which is, to kind of really zero in on the counterculture and the reaction in the 60s, the kind of the desires to kind of push back against a system that is seen as very kind of restrictive, and to think about television and electronic media in kind of new ways. And if we're talking about thinking about electronic media in new ways, Marshall McLuhan is perhaps the kind of the archetype of this, or one of the kind of pioneers in terms of media studies. Definitely, he's a Canadian scholar of media and communication and a key figure in the Toronto School of Communication Theory. And he's famous for the slogan, "The medium is the message." But he also sees media as a kind of extension of human senses. For him, electricity is very important, and he coins this idea of the global village, which is that electronic media helps to kind of collapse space and time and connects people worldwide into a kind of shared experience. And for him, electricity is sort of like, extension of the human nervous system. So it is important for him, despite Alan Turing saying, no, electricity is less important. Actually, McLuhan brings electricity back in. And McLuhan, I think Dewey would be quite skeptical of McLuhan, because I think McLuhan is, in a sense, sort of pushing this message about losing the individual in the crowd. The global village is sort of like a kind of shared communal experience. And so, for example, McLuhan says that when we read a book, the book becomes like an extension of our eye. All of our other sensory inputs, our sensory data, just kind of fades away, and we're just focusing on our eye and the kind of the experience of kind of reading the book. Maybe our fingers. You've got kind of some thumbs in the illustration here, where you're kind of getting this kind of tactile sensation through your nervous system, but you're kind of like the other senses are kind of being ignored or kind of fading away. And he developed this concept of hot versus cool media. So hot media extends one sense in a lot of detail, like the eye. If you watch something like a film, you're dragged into the film, and you're really thinking visually. But your other kind of senses are kind of low definition. But there's not much filling in the blanks. There's no kind of audience participation. And then cool media, which he defined as having a very high audience participation. So less sensory data, let your senses are not being stimulated so much. You have to kind of fill in the gaps. And he gives examples of television, which is very low resolution compared to film at the time. It becomes higher resolution later on. Telephone, where you kind of like have to kind of fill in the gaps because you can only hear, and then comic books as well. You're kind of like, you're doing a lot of work in order to interpret and understand what is going on. So yeah, you can see he believes electric circuitry is an extension of the central nervous system. We'll skip the first AI winter. I think that the important thing to say about McLuhan is that his ideas are really popular in the counterculture. Very, very popular. And they, through the counterculture, they start to kind of feed into Silicon Valley. In the 1970s, you begin to get technological systems that can start to kind of, you can begin to imagine distributed audience response systems at scale. So, we saw the kind of early, from the 1930s, these early feedback systems where you kind of press a like button. By the 70s, you can start to support these, people's households, and you can start to imagine different kind of ways of doing politics, different kind of paradigms where you press buttons, and maybe, your political leaders will be responsive to this like button data, which is coming in real time, in a way that you just couldn't imagine in the 50s or 40s, before the kind of these electronic systems are possible. And there's lots of experiments done globally. There's one in the top left in Japan. Canada was looking into this, the UK. I'm really studying these. So this is what I'm kind of really fascinated by as the projects that I look at. So I'll skip over this is one from West Germany, similar project to the kind of town hall project, except now not only is civic education a goal, but actually participatory decision making. Oh, maybe because we have the technology, perhaps these projects can, these kind of deliberative projects don't have to just be an education exercise. They can actually be decision making. So you could press a button, if you agree with the decision, or press a button if you disagree. And that would be, you know, a new way of doing politics. But the final thing I want to kind of end with, because I want to bring this to Silicon Valley and to our present moment, is the ways that these ideas, Marshall McLuhan, cybernetics, kind of informed Silicon Valley culture. One of the projects that I study, for example, is community memory from 1972. This is from the project manager, or one of the project managers, Lee Felsenstein. It's a radical democratic project. It's run by radical activists. You could think of them as kind of as countercultural types. They're kind of very much against the system, against the man. And he says village structures are based upon the agora. So again, this ideal entity of democratic life or democratic living, a public place of assembly wherein public information is exchanged, a sort of commons of information. Development of village-like situations requires the creation of such agoras. Computers make possible commons of information in conjunction with other media. And this has been this is a kind of example of people using community memory. You know, computer terminals were placed in public spaces, free or very low cost to use. People would come up and kind of, basically a very, very early example of a social network. They would send messages to each other. You could think of this as a kind of pre-social media, you know, like prototype social media. But this kind of ideology of bottom-up, networked kind of democracy without any kind of institutions, without governments. This is criticized as something called the kind of Californian ideology, coming from Silicon Valley, California, you know, West Coast counterculture. This is from Barbrook and Cameron from 1996. They wrote they're two media theorists who wrote a kind of polemic saying that, influenced by the theories of Marshall McLuhan around a global village, and, you know, electricity is kind of an extension of the central nervous system, these technophiliacs, these kind of West Coast hippie technologists, who would then go on to kind of be really foundational in, for example, the personal computer and kind of Silicon Valley and the future of Silicon Valley, they thought that the convergence of media, communications, and telecommunications would inevitably create the electronic agora, an electronic platform, a virtual place where everyone would be able to express their opinions without fear of censorship. Barbrook and Cameron are very critical of this. We can see some kind of, and there is a kind of, I think, the historian Fred Turner, who I've already mentioned, has kind of very clearly set out how these ideas, which are swimming around and circulating in California, how they kind of really very influential in the culture of Silicon Valley, going into things like early kind of social media, but also early social networks, but also into kind of figures like Steve Jobs, for example, who kind of straddles both the counterculture. He's got very kind of holistic kind of systems thinking ideas, but also he's also a businessman. He's kind of wanting to create products that will sell, that kind of can both be transformative socially, but also make a profit as well. So this is an Apple advert from the kind of 1980s, where I think this is from 1984. It's a famous advert which was filmed by I forget his name, the director who did Ridley Scott, the director of Alien, sorry. And it's a kind of John Hurt is playing Big Brother here, who stands in for kind of IBM, this big old-fashioned hierarchical way of doing computing. And Apple comes in as this kind of new way of doing computing, very kind of individual, very kind of bottom-up, and this woman throws a hammer through the screen and kind of liberates everyone from their sort of corporate drudgery, which fits nicely with the kind of the zeitgeist of the time, which was kind of, let's break down the old social structures and political structures, and we'll have kind of new market-based approaches, which will be distributed, which will be kind of innovative, and also will be based not upon the kind of old fussy rules of the kind of high modernist 1950s, but will be kind of based upon, the sort of the greed and the kind of impulses and the kind of irrationality, a kind of embrace of irrationality. So kind of pushing away from kind of rational rules-based approaches. And again, I'm not doing this to say, one approach is good and one approach is bad. I think that's a very simplistic reading. I think Dewey would be kind of critical of that reading, I think it's just important to be aware of how these shifts are taking place over time. How we're getting kind of changes, even though terms are being presented as being stable, behind the scenes, with terms like democracy, with terms like artificial intelligence, with terms like collective intelligence, with all the computer, all these sort of terms, there are shifts, historical shifts that are taking place that you can only really see if you take this long historical approach, right? So we should be, I think, always a little kind of sensitive to people who are coming and saying, oh, this is a radically new thing. Absolutely. But at the same time, we should be aware of kind of shifts and changes over time. And just to wrap up, this is an electronic town hall from the first electronic town hall involving the White House directly. This is Al Gore, vice president in the Clinton White House, who is now at a personal computer. So we've gone from these mass audiences through television to him sitting atomized and discrete in front of a computer, responding one-on-one. As kind of questions come in, he types out his answer in response. This is all of by the 1990s, the kind of the World Wide Web is the kind of the technology that has supplanted the television as this kind of futuristic new technology, which is going to transform everything. This is an example of a town hall run in the Netherlands, where I am based, in North Brabant, asking participants, is Brabant running out of space? And this is all done sitting at your computer, kind of typing your thoughts and your kind of ideas about how Brabant should solve this problem online. We might start to recognize this in terms of social media. And then here is President Obama, who is doing the first Twitter town hall I think this is around 2008. And then Elon Musk, here he is. This is, I think, 2020, I believe, when Elon Musk, the X, as it's now known, is staging an X town hall with Donald Trump. And we also have AI town halls and AI agoras and so on. These are also being kind of promoted. And this now fits on your pocket. So where we've gone from radio to television to the computer, now we're in the smartphone era. A final thought I'll just leave you with a tweet from Elon Musk, who brings us right back to the history of cybernetics and thinks about X as a cybernetic collective superintelligence. So he says, because it consists of billions of bidirectional interactions per day, Twitter can be thought of as a collective cybernetic superintelligence. He says this in 2022, just before he buys it, and then changes the name to X. He has most recently merged his AI company XAI into X. Actually, he's also merged his space company in as well, SpaceX. He trains Grok, which is the kind of the flagship AI model, on the data of participants on X. So you get this kind of like, what is an AI? What is collective intelligence? In X, they're starting to kind of blur. And just be really sensitive to how Elon Musk is using these terms: artificial intelligence, cybernetics, collective intelligence, because they're hiding an awful lot when he uses these terms. And just I'll leave you with Dewey as the final, before I open for some questions. Remember, don't lose sight of the individual human in the mob, but at the same time, don't, I think it's important. There is this unresolvable tension between the collective and then the individual. And Dewey is sort of saying it doesn't make sense to think of one without the other. You have to see them as being in a kind of relationship. What does this mean for practitioners? We can talk about this more in the Q&A, which I'll open the floor now, maybe, but just a couple of, maybe to prime the pump, a couple of things that we can think of. First of all, treat AI as a site of inquiry. I think Dewey would say this, not as a tool to be adopted or rejected, which means building kind of adult learning spaces where learners can talk about these sort of things that we've been kind of going through over the last hour and a half, how AI systems shape work, knowledge, and public life, and how they're kind of embedded in different aspects of life and not just these tools. And then design AI infrastructures to enlarge the public. So use platforms and data practices that kind of foster communication across differences, support collective problem solving, and then make algorithmic decisions transparent and contestable. If we see things like corporate governments and regulation as part of AI, that changes the kind of how we're no longer thinking of AI just as this sort of mysterious black box, but rather as kind of sets of systems and practices that are kind of embedded in other systems and practices. So that I think can help us to sort of start to kind of see them as political, but also to see them as sites of contestation. And the final thing, make it participatory and experimental. Louis would definitely say this. Support learner-led experimentation with AI tools, linking practical use to reflection on consequences for democracy, agency, and shared life. I think that would definitely be Dewey's message, and I would want to impart that message as well. Right. Thank you very much. That is the end of my talk.
Thank you so much, Joe. It was absolutely relevant, interesting, and up to date. I mean, we need this really long-term perspective dealing with AI. I saw that we have plenty of comments and questions on the chat, so I'll invite my colleague Gianluca to talk us a bit about what happened in the chat.
Yes. Thank you, Claudia. I repeat what you just said about the presentation was also very stimulating on my side. And also from what I followed in the chat, there are a lot of comments of appreciation, but also some questions that hopefully will lead to some collective reflection. I invite the people that I will mention, whose comments I will mention, to interact if they wish. Otherwise, I will simply read the comments and Joe will reply if he wishes. So the first one that I noticed that arrived quite at the beginning of your presentation, Joe, was by Iliana Petrov. I'm sorry if the presentation was the pronunciation of the name is not correct. When you were speaking about the switch from mass democracy to mass media, and she asks if your focus was mostly the United States, international or European, and if you have a geographical scope or limitation.
Shall I answer as if we just go okay, fine, perfect. Yes, absolutely. Sorry, I should have perhaps been clearer. No, it is indeed. So my focus, I have both in terms of my period, which is late 1950s, early 1960s to 1999, like the kind of turn of the millennium, but then obviously I try to bring in the kind of longue durée, so kind of going back to the 19th century in order to sketch out those kind of long histories. But I also geographically am focusing on the United States and Europe, Western Europe. There's a couple of reasons for this. One is just that when we think of democracy in the 1930s, when radio town halls are starting, it's only, democracy is, the number of democracies in the world is lower than it is today. The United States, Canada, some countries in Western Europe. So there's only a couple of countries in the world which you could think of in terms of like universal suffrage, pluralist democracies. And in fact, really the kind of the way that we conceptualize democracy is actually kind of, I would argue, a sort of post-war thing. So I'm looking at, which of those countries where we can see this emerge. And I think North America and Western Europe, I think are kind of, I think there's a logic behind why I would focus geographically only on those countries, given that many countries are either not pretending to be democracies, or they have different kind of forms of democracy. So the Soviet Union, for example, is arguing that they have a sort of Soviet democracy, but it's configured in a different way. And I think most historians would say there's a logic for not looking at experiments in the Soviet Union, whereas you can look in Western Europe and North America. And the second reason is because the technology, a lot of these experiments are quite expensive to run. Because if you're running on computer networks in the 70s, there are not that many computer networks. It's quite expensive to set up a technology using, the costs come right down by the 90s, but in the 70s they're very, very high. And the technology, there's just not that many places in the world which are, producing these systems. So they're very kind of experimental. So you start to see the emergence of these technological systems really, I think, in certain places in the United States, also in the Soviet Union, also in kind of China and so on. But yeah, I think there's a logic for me focusing on essentially the transnational dissemination of ideas about electronic democracy from the United States, particularly around kind of Californian ideology and Silicon Valley, coming into Europe and really influencing a lot of people, particularly in Brussels, actually. What I'm really interested in is in the 90s, how are people getting super excited by these ideas like cyber democracy and teledemocracy coming from the US? And how are institutions like the European Union, in the early 90s, how are they kind of starting to institutionalize these ideas? Like EPALE has, I would love to look into the history of EPALE. How does someone sit down and go, oh, we need an electronic platform for adult learning in Europe? Like these terms are really they're very sexy terms in the 90s. I don't actually know EPALE's history. I've been interested to hear if it dates back to the 90s, but certainly at that time, a lot of kind of platforms are being set up in order to kind of make use of these exciting new tools from these revolutionary new tools from the US, and also in a sense because Europe feels under threat. Right, in the 90s, Europe feels, oh, the US has its information superhighway. We need to offer a European alternative, which is the European Information Society, which is able to preserve the European social model, but still adapt to kind of new technologies, which are seen to be kind of, revolutionizing society and changing how things, how kind of society is organized and the economy and so on. So again, we're in a moment now where this is very clear. We feel this, right? We need to catch up with America. But this is not the first time Europe has been in this moment. In the 90s, it was very similar, and we had this in the 80s. There's precedence to all of these feelings of revolution and new technologies coming in. And I think that my geographical focus on Western Europe and North America helps me to kind of surface that. Sorry, that's a long answer, but I wanted to get in the bit about Europe in the 90s as well.
Thank you. And just to reply to your, EPALE is only 10 years old, so it doesn't go back to the period that you're referring to, but definitely can evolve around the topics that we're addressing today. We also have a question from Denise, who asks, what are your thoughts on governance in AI and the recent Pentagon threat to blacklist Anthropic if it refuses to drop AI guardrails for use by the US military?
Yeah, I mean, it's very concerning. I think so. There are anxieties, again, historical anxieties around how computers will be used as surveillance tools. And these go back, in the 1940s when Norbert Wiener was writing cybernetics. The way it was received in France was as, the Americans are designing a governing machine. They're designing a system that will be able to completely control and regulate humans, like we are just interchangeable components within a machine. So this anxiety there's a lot of kind of fears of this kind of governing machine or kind of dystopian, so like 1984 type scenarios where the state is using sophisticated surveillance technologies to kind of keep tabs on everyone, right? There's some wonderful kind of examples of cultural depictions of it. Like if anyone has seen the French film Alphaville from the 60s, there's a kind of computer which controls society and everyone is kind of a sort of, regulated and surveyed. Doesn't mean it's not a real genuine threat, because there has been historically this anxiety, but what is happening with Anthropic is deeply concerning, and I think the European Union should be, if I was a policymaker, I would be issuing stern, what is it that the EU leaders always do? They note with grave concern. I would be noting with grave concern democratic backsliding in the United States. And I would do that publicly. Like, it is not acceptable. And it should, and I know that we are in a very precarious geopolitical situation with, the tariffs and all these sort of things. But I think that we do need to stand up for our values and say, this is very concerning. If Anthropic is kind of raising this kind of warning that the United States, they don't feel that their systems should be used in this manner, I do think that it should at least be commented upon. So I share the concern from the commenter.
Thank you. We also have another one from Dora, who is more that is more related to the fears and concerns that we have nowadays related to this huge topic. I will also read her quite elaborate thought on this. So she says that she asks if, in your opinion, is there a reason for the hype that we have about AI and for fears we have of ceasing to be a democracy? She says, I recently read the democracies are decreasing in number around the world. And since we can't stop the evolution of AI, what can we do to continue to be and live in a democracy with the values we had before the AI inception? And also she sees this as what can we do as individuals, not only as a collective?
Wonderful. A fantastic question. Really, really good. So I would say, so again, let's take a long historical view. There has been hype and there have been fears and anxieties over, over this long durée of this long kind of history of AI. And they have come in and out and but there have been also periods such as during the 30s when democracy has been really on the back foot. One of the America's Town Meeting of the Air, the first episode of that show was which way should America go? Fascism, communism, or democracy? Right. This is and now we're in this moment where we're kind of thinking about authoritarianism in the United States and in other countries. I don't think it's just the case that it feels like democracies are kind of decreasing in number. I do think that there is a kind of trend towards backsliding. If you think of a wave of democratization coming out of the 70s, of the 90s, this the end of history moment in the 90s when democracy was going to spread everywhere around the world, it doesn't feel like we're in that moment. It feels a bit more like the 30s when democracy is kind of on the back foot. So I think the important thing to say is, waves of hype and fear, they kind of come and go. It's happened before, and the approach, what we can do, how do we kind of push back against this? Well, first is not to see AI as like an inception, like a kind of radical moment, a radical break. These are like questions about the power of the state, about democracy and kind of mass society. These are old questions, and we need to understand that we have solved these challenges, these massive, complex social challenges in the past, and we can do it today again. So first of all, a little bit of confidence, but also I think Dewey's approach, let's take a kind of pragmatic, experimentalist approach. I think this is one of the things that happened in the 30s when FDR sort of said, look, the thing that we have to fear is fear itself. And through something like the New Deal, they began experimenting. With the New Deal, they didn't quite know exactly how to escape from the Great Depression, right? How to get out of this slump that the economy had found itself in. But they tried different things. One of the experiments that they did in terms of democracy was to kind of start. There was funding, New Deal funding, which went to experiments like America's Town Meeting of the Air, but also kind of like radio town hall, like local kind of radio town hall experiments. And I think the answer is just we don't know exactly what is going to get us out of this. We don't know exactly, but we should try different things. We should look to history. We should kind of consider what's working, what's not working, share best practices. There are things that we can do which require us to kind of have a kind of more confident experimental attitude that democracy can kind of endure. So don't doom don't doom about democracy would be my message. Take it seriously, the threat. I do think that democracies are on the back foot right now, but have a confidence that actually there's a reason why countries want to join the European Union right now, right? There's a reason why I think we should see ourselves, as essentially representing democracy, Europe, and I think have a bit of confidence in that. Represent it well, experiment, try different things pragmatically.
Thank you. I will get to another one, and then our time, I believe, is slowly getting to an end, unfortunately. A message by Eva that just left it in the chat that addresses a very dramatic and current topic. She says, perhaps it is more the case that the movement toward illiberal control over people through digital means happens gradually. For example, as one sees that ICE has a completely different ability to find and target people through social media and other data that are not part of public registry data. So it's rather more a comment than a...
Yeah, although I can respond to it, I can link it maybe a little bit to the previous kind of comment about what can we do. I mean, so I really think if we see things like artificial intelligence as systems, like have a much more kind of holistic sense of what these are, then I think it becomes easier to imagine how we might control and regulate these things. So start seeing ICE, so for example, ICE uses, a kind of mix of technical systems that they control. They also kind of buy systems, they're kind of working with the private sector and so on. So see that kind of private sector involvement, that kind of public-private partnership, which the kind of surveillance state is sort of developing as a kind of holistic system. Don't just see ICE as this one thing which kind of like, sits on its own, but rather see how these kind of these supply chains of data, these kind of networks of how data is kind of gathered and used and processed as all part of this emerging kind of surveillance economy, right? So or surveillance ecology, maybe you could put it that way. I think once we start thinking about it that way, you can start thinking about interventions about, how would you design this, or how would you kind of like reconfigure this to be more democratic, to be more transparent, to be more like, what should be the role of the private sector? How can you kind of design regulations which are kind of ensuring that data is protected, that privacy is protected? And so, yeah, so the thing that Europe could absolutely do is not start watering down its privacy and data regulation in order to kind of compete with the US. I think that's something that we should not do. That would be terrible. Rather, we should be thinking about the regulation of AI as part of AI. Right? So we think about our institutions and our political processes and our kind of democratic political systems as part of these systems which we're building. And that is, I think, a much better way, and it's also a much more optimistic and hopeful way, because it empowers us. Right? It makes us, it's suddenly this big scary thing hasn't arrived from the future, this AI agent, which has got kind of a mind of its own, and it's a black box, and it's a bit kind of mystical, and we don't really know what it is. But actually we think, oh no, open up the black box. Like really, this is part of systems and kind of, supply chains of data, and there's a kind of embeddedness which empowers us as well as part of these systems. And so the more that we empower ourselves and that we feel kind of actually this is an achievable problem, it's a solvable problem. We may need to experiment in order to solve it, but we can do this, and we've done it before. That, I think, is part of the solution. It helps us to kind of at least have the right mindset to kind of begin fixing some of the things that do need fixing.
Thank you. I think this really helps us to have also another positive perspective onto this current matter. So thanks again, and thanks to everyone that have commented in the chat. We have much more questions, but our time is up. So I leave the floor to Claudia again for the closing. Thank you.
Thanks, Gianluca, and thanks, Joe. Thank you, everyone, for being here today, for keeping the conversation alive. I think that today's discussion is exactly what EPALE needs and what EPALE is. Actually, it's thinking together, questioning things critically, openly, and thinking and building the future we'd like to see in Europe. So please keep an eye on EPALE in the next few days, since you will be able to rewatch this session and to still comment and grow together through EPALE, through the conversation and the comments, and keep the discussion alive. So thanks, everyone. Thanks, Joe, and goodbye.